The golden glow of the setting sun painted the Wyoming landscape in hues of amber and crimson as Penelope Hargrove sat perched on a weathered fence rail, her skirts billowing slightly in the warm summer breeze of 1875. She'd fled Boston 3 weeks ago, trading her corsets and calling cards for denim and dust, seeking something even she couldn't name. The ranch behind her belonged to her late uncle, a place she'd never seen until the lawyer's letter arrived informing her of her inheritance, a small piece of the frontier that now represented both her escape and her uncertain future. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from her reverie. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the dying light. Penelope straightened her spine but remained where she was, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun's final rays. As the stranger drew closer, she could make out his broad shoulders, the dust-covered denim, and the well-worn hat that marked him unmistakably as a man of the West. "Evening, madam," the rider called, tipping his hat as he reined his horse to a stop several feet from where she sat. His voice carried a gentle southern drawl, softening the edges of his words. "You're a fair way from town to be watching the sunset alone." "I own this land," Penelope replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Or at least, that's what the papers say." The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace that belied his large frame. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a face weathered by sun and wind. "Isaac Walker." He introduced himself with a slight bow that seemed incongruous with his rugged appearance. "I run cattle on the neighboring spread." "Penelope Hargrove," she returned, not offering her hand. Isaac's gaze swept over the modest ranch house behind her, the small barn, and the few acres of land that stretched between. "Martin Hargrove's niece," he said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Folks in town mentioned you might be coming to claim the place." Penelope nodded, turning her attention back to the horizon where the sun was making its final descent. Something about this man made her uncomfortable, though not in a threatening way. Perhaps it was simply that he was the first person who'd spoken more than 10 words to her since she'd arrived. "Tell me, Miss Hargrove," Isaac said, leaning against the fence a respectful distance away, "what brings a Boston lady to Wyoming territory? This ain't exactly paradise for most Eastern folks." "How do you know I'm from Boston?" she asked, suddenly wary. Isaac smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Your accent gives you away. Plus, your uncle mentioned you a time or two when we shared a drink." The mention of her uncle, a man she barely remembered from childhood visits, brought an unexpected pang of regret. She'd never know him now. "I needed a change," she said simply, unwilling to share more with this stranger. Isaac studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the stunning panorama before them, the rolling plains, distant mountains, and sky ablaze with color. "Tell me where you'd rather be," he said softly. The question caught her off guard. Where would she rather be? Not Boston, with its suffocating social expectations and the scandals she'd left behind. Not in her parents' home, where disappointment hung in the air like a perpetual fog. Certainly not in the arms of Charles Winthrop, whose betrayal had finally given her the courage to flee. "Nowhere," she answered truthfully. "Right now, there's nowhere else I'd rather be." Something flickered in Isaac's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He nodded once, as if she'd passed some unspoken test. "Well then, Miss Hargrove," he said, "welcome to Wyoming." He glanced at the small ranch house. "You planning to work this place yourself?" Penelope laughed despite herself, the sound startling after weeks of solitude. "I haven't the faintest idea how to run a ranch. I barely know which end of a horse is which." "That would be the front and the back," Isaac replied with a straight face, though his eyes twinkled with humor. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Penelope felt herself smile genuinely. "Thank you for that illuminating information, Mr. Walker." "Isaac," he corrected. "We don't stand much on formality out here." "Then you must call me Penelope," she returned, surprising herself with the offer. As the last sliver of sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Isaac straightened and moved back to his horse. Night comes quick out here. You shouldn't be alone after dark. Coyotes get bold sometimes. I have a rifle, Penelope said, though she'd never fired one in her life. Isaac's expression suggested he wasn't fooled. Do you know how to use it? When she didn't answer, he nodded as if coming to a decision. I'll be by tomorrow morning. Seems to me a neighbor ought to help a neighbor get settled in. Before she could protest, he added, Your uncle was a good man. He'd want someone looking out for you. With that, he swung himself back into the saddle with practiced ease. Good evening, Penelope, he said, tipping his hat once more before turning his horse toward the darkening plains. Penelope remained on the fence rail long after he'd disappeared from sight, watching as stars began to prick the vast canvas of the Wyoming sky. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if perhaps she might find what she was seeking in this wild, unfamiliar place. The morning brought clear skies and, as promised, Isaac Walker. Penelope had risen with the sun, still unaccustomed to the early rhythms of ranch life. She'd attempted to make coffee on the temperamental stove and was staring despairingly at the bitter, gritty results when a knock sounded at the door. Isaac stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking freshly shaved and somewhat less dusty than the previous evening. Behind him, a wagon was loaded with tools and what appeared to be supplies. Good morning, he greeted her, his eyes taking in her simple dress and hastily pinned hair. Hope I'm not too early. Not at all, Penelope replied, suddenly conscious of her appearance. In Boston, she wouldn't have received visitors without being properly coiffed and corseted. Here, such concerns seemed absurdly impractical. I was just making coffee, though I fear it's not fit for consumption. Isaac's mouth twitched. Mind if I try my hand? Been making Cowboy coffee since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. In her small kitchen, Isaac moved with surprising efficiency, disposing of her failed attempt and starting fresh. As he worked, he explained what he'd brought. Lumber for your fenced north section's about to fall over. Some tools I thought you might need. Seeds for a kitchen garden, if you've a mind to plant one. That's very generous, Penelope said, taken aback by his thoughtfulness. But I can't accept charity. Isaac handed her a cup of coffee that smelled heavenly compared to her own attempt. Not charity. Your uncle helped me when I was getting started. Just passing on the favor. He met her eyes directly. Besides, out here, we look after our own. You're Wyoming now, whether you know it or not. Something in his words touched Penelope deeply. In Boston, she'd been surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Here, in this vast wilderness, a stranger was offering genuine kindness with no apparent agenda. Thank you, she said simply, accepting both the coffee and his help. They spent the morning assessing the small ranch. The house itself was sound but needed repairs to the roof and porch. The barn housed 2 elderly horses that seemed pleased for the attention, a milk cow that eyed them suspiciously, and a handful of chickens that scattered at their approach. It's not much, Isaac admitted as they walked the property line. But with work, it could sustain you. The grazing's good enough for a small herd, if you were interested in cattle. Penelope laughed. I don't know the first thing about cattle. You can learn, Isaac said with a certainty that both frightened and exhilarated her. Everyone starts somewhere. By midday, they'd repaired the worst section of fence, and Isaac had shown her how to milk the cow, a messy lesson that left them both laughing. As they sat in the shade of an old oak tree sharing the lunch Penelope had prepared, she found herself telling him about Boston, her family's shipping business, and her decision to leave it all behind. They expected me to marry well, produce heirs, and attend the right parties, she explained, surprising herself with her candor. When my fiancé proved unfaithful, it seemed like a sign to change course entirely. Isaac listened without judgment, his face thoughtful. Sometimes the path we're expected to follow isn't the one meant for us, he said finally. My father wanted me to take over his mercantile in Virginia. I wanted open skies and room to breathe. And are you happy with your choice? Penelope asked. Isaac gazed out over the rolling plains. Most days. It's not an easy life, but it's honest. You know where you stand with cattle and horses. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Unlike people, the unspoken addition hung between them. As the day progressed, Penelope found herself watching Isaac when he wasn't looking, the way his hands moved confidently over broken things, making them whole again, the gentle way he spoke to the animals, the respect with which he treated her, either condescending nor flirtatious. By the time he loaded his tools back into the wagon, the sun was beginning its descent once more. "I've taken up your entire day," Penelope said, walking with him to his wagon. "You must have your own work waiting." "My foreman can handle things for a day," Isaac replied easily. "Besides, this was more interesting than mending my own fences." Before leaving, he hesitated, then said, "There's a social at the church in town Saturday night. Might be a good chance for you to meet some of the other local folks." When she didn't immediately respond, he added, "I could escort you if you'd like. Save you from having to walk in alone." Penelope considered the offer. In Boston, accepting would have carried significant implications. Here, she suspected it was simply neighborly kindness. Still, something in his eyes suggested perhaps more than neighborly interest. "I would appreciate that," she said finally. "Though I warn you, my dancing skills may not be suited to Western tastes." Isaac's smile brightened his weather-worn face. "Reckon we'll manage just fine." He climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "I'll be by at 6 on Saturday, then." As she watched him drive away, Penelope found herself anticipating Saturday with an eagerness that surprised her. It had been a long time since she'd looked forward to anything at all. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Penelope threw herself into improving her new home. She cleaned the small house from top to bottom, arranged her few possessions, and even attempted to bake bread using the recipe Isaac had scribbled down for her. The result was dense and slightly burnt, but edible, a small victory she celebrated alone. She also explored her property more thoroughly, discovering a small creek that ran along the eastern boundary and a grove of trees that offered welcome shade. The solitude, which had initially seemed oppressive, began to feel peaceful instead. Each evening, she found herself sitting on the fence rail, watching the sunset and reflecting on the day. By Saturday, nervous anticipation had taken hold. Penelope spent far too long deciding which of her few dresses would be appropriate for a country social. In Boston, she'd had dozens of gowns for every occasion. Here, her wardrobe was limited to what she'd been able to bring in 2 trunks. Finally, she settled on a blue cotton dress, simple by her former standards but well made and flattering. Isaac arrived precisely at 6, driving a polished buggy rather than his work wagon. He traded his work clothes for clean denims, a pressed shirt, and a coat that, while not new, had been well cared for. When he removed his hat, Penelope noticed he'd attempted to tame his sun-streaked brown hair, though a few rebellious strands still fell across his forehead. "You look lovely," he said simply, his eyes appreciative but respectful. "Thank you," Penelope replied, feeling unaccountably shy. "You clean up quite nicely yourself." The drive to town took nearly an hour, during which Isaac pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's history. Penelope found herself relaxing in his company, laughing at his droll observations about their neighbors and asking questions about ranch life that would have bored her to tears in her previous existence. Prosperity, Wyoming was hardly more than a wide spot in the road, a single main street lined with essential businesses, a small church, and a schoolhouse. Tonight, lanterns illuminated the churchyard where tables had been set up and a small band was tuning their instruments on the porch. "It's not exactly the Boston Symphony," Isaac said apologetically as he helped her down from the buggy. "It's perfect," Penelope assured him, finding she meant it. The social was in full swing when they arrived. Children darted between tables, women arranged food on long trestle tables, and men gathered in small groups, discussing cattle prices and weather forecasts. Conversation paused briefly as heads turned to observe the newcomer, but unlike the measuring looks she was accustomed to in Boston society, these gazes held simple curiosity. Isaac introduced her around, his hand a reassuring presence at the small of her back. Penelope met so many people that names and faces began to blur together, but everyone welcomed her with genuine warmth. The women, particularly, seemed pleased to have a new addition to their small community. "We'd be delighted if you'd join our quilting circle on Tuesdays," offered Martha Peterson, the blacksmith's wife. "Don't worry if you've never quilted before, we'll teach you. And we could certainly use another voice in the church choir," added Ellen Simmons, the pastor's wife. "Do you sing, dear?" "Only very poorly," Penelope admitted with a laugh. "That's what they all say," Ellen replied with a knowing smile. "Yet somehow we make a joyful noise together." As the evening progressed, the band struck up a lively tune and couples moved to the cleared area in front of the church. Isaac turned to Penelope, a question in his eyes. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, extending his hand. "I warned you about my dancing," Penelope reminded him, but placed her hand in his. "Just follow my lead," Isaac said, guiding her into the circle of dancers. The dance was nothing like the formal waltzes and quadrilles of Boston ballrooms. This was energetic and unpretentious, with much laughter and occasional missteps that were met with good humor rather than disapproval. Isaac proved to be an excellent dancer, his movements fluid and confident as he guided her through the unfamiliar steps. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" Penelope asked, breathless after a particularly spirited reel. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," Isaac replied, his hand warm against hers. "Said a man who can dance would never lack for female company." "Wise woman," Penelope said, smiling up at him. As the evening cooled, lanterns glowed more brightly against the darkening sky, and the music shifted to slower, more romantic tunes. Isaac drew Penelope closer for a waltz, his hand respectful at her waist, but his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked softly. "More than I have in years," she answered truthfully. When the dance ended, Isaac suggested they take a walk to cool off. They strolled to the edge of town, where the vast Wyoming prairie stretched before them under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Penelope had ever seen. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, tilting her head back to take in the celestial display. "This is what I love most about this place," Isaac said, his voice low. "Makes a man feel small and significant all at once. Like you're part of something bigger than yourself." Penelope glanced at him, struck by the unexpected poetry in his words. "I'm beginning to understand why you chose this life." Isaac turned to face her, his expression serious in the starlight. "And what about you, Penelope Hargrove? Did you come here just to escape, or are you looking for something?" The question penetrated deeper than she expected, touching the restlessness that had driven her west. "Perhaps both," she admitted. "I knew what I was running from, but I'm not sure yet what I'm running toward." "Fair enough," Isaac nodded. "Some journeys are like that, you don't know the destination until you arrive." They walked back to the social and companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As the evening drew to a close, they said their goodbyes and headed back to Penelope's ranch under a star-filled sky. At her door, Isaac helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," he said formally. "Thank you for introducing me to your world," Penelope replied. "I enjoyed myself immensely." Isaac hesitated, then spoke with careful deliberation. "I'd like to call on you again, if you'd permit it." In the lamplight spilling from her open door, Penelope could see the uncertainty in his eyes, a vulnerability at odds with his capable exterior. It touched something in her that had been dormant for too long. "I would like that very much," she said softly. A smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Good night, then, Penelope," he said, and on impulse, he lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture that belonged more to drawing rooms than to the Wyoming frontier. "Good night, Isaac," she whispered, and watched him drive away into the darkness, her hand still warm where his lips had touched it. Over the following weeks, Isaac became a regular visitor at Penelope's ranch. True to his word, he helped her learn the basics of ranch management, showing her how to repair fences, care for the animals, and recognize the signs of changing weather. In return, Penelope shared her knowledge of books and music, reading aloud in the evenings while Isaac worked on leather repairs or whittled intricate figures from pieces of wood. June turned to July, bringing scorching days and spectacular thunderstorms that rolled across the plains with majestic fury. During one such storm, Isaac arrived at Penelope's door drenched and bearing an armful of books from his own collection. "Thought you might enjoy some new reading material," he explained as she ushered him inside. "Power of the written word shouldn't be underestimated out here where it's scarce." While he dried himself by the fire, Penelope examined his offerings: several well-worn novels, a volume of poetry, and a practical guide to Western ranching. "These are treasures," she said, running her fingers over the embossed spine of Tennyson's poems. "I didn't expect to find such literary appreciation in a cowboy." Isaac looked up, a spark of something hurt, perhaps, in his eyes. "There's a lot about me you might not expect, Miss Hargrove." Penelope flushed, recognizing her unintentional condescension. "I apologize. That was thoughtless of me." Isaac's expression softened. "No harm done. But yes, I read. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. Our house was full of books." A shadow crossed his face. "After the war, when there wasn't much left of our Virginia home, books were among the few possessions I brought west." The mention of the war, a subject he rarely touched upon, caught Penelope's attention. "You fought in the war?" Isaac nodded, his eyes distant. "Confederate cavalry. Joined up at 17, thinking it was my duty." He stared into the fire. "Found out quick enough that war isn't what young men imagine it to be." Penelope sat beside him, suddenly aware of the depth of experiences that had shaped this man. "Is that why you came west? To leave those memories behind?" "Partly," Isaac admitted. "After Appomattox, there wasn't much to go back to. My father's store had been destroyed, my mother had died during the war, and my 2 brothers were buried at Gettysburg." He spoke matter-of-factly, but Penelope could hear the old pain beneath his words. "I'm sorry," she said softly, placing her hand over his. Isaac turned his palm up, entwining his fingers with hers. "It was a lifetime ago. But yes, I came west for a fresh start. To build something new from nothing." The thunder rumbled outside, rain lashing against the windows as they sat in silence, hands joined, the fire crackling in the hearth. "Would you read something?" Isaac asked eventually. "I always enjoyed hearing poetry aloud." Penelope opened the Tennyson volume, finding comfort in the familiar verses as she read by firelight, conscious of Isaac's gaze upon her. When she finished, "Ulysses," his eyes were thoughtful. "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield," he quoted. "That's the West in a single line, isn't it? Is that why you stay?" she asked. "For the struggle itself?" "No," Isaac said simply. "I stayed because this is where I found peace." His eyes held hers. "What about you, Penelope? Will you stay?" The question hung between them, layered with meaning beyond the simple words. Penelope looked around the small cabin that had, somehow, become home in the short time she'd been there. "I think I might," she said slowly. "There's something honest about this life that appeals to me." Isaac's smile was warm with approval. "You're stronger than you know. Most Eastern ladies would have run back to civilization by now." "Perhaps I'm not most ladies," Penelope challenged, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "No," Isaac agreed, his voice deepening. "You most certainly are not." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then lightning flashed, startlingly close, breaking the spell. Isaac rose reluctantly. "I should go before this storm worsens," he said, though he made no move toward the door. "You could stay," Penelope offered impulsively, then blushed at his raised eyebrow. "I mean, in the spare room. It would be foolish to ride in this weather." For a moment, she thought he might accept. Then he shook his head regretfully. "Tempting as that is, I value your reputation too highly. Towns like Prosperity have long memories and longer tongues. He was right, of course. Even in the relatively free society of the frontier, certain proprieties were still observed. Still, Penelope felt disappointed as she walked him to the door. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked. Isaac paused on the threshold, rain pelting down behind him. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised, and then, in a move that surprised them both, he leaned down and brushed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was brief, a whisper of contact, but it left Penelope breathless. Before she could respond, Isaac had stepped into the storm, pulling his hat low over his eyes. "Sleep well, Penelope," he called over his shoulder, and then he was gone, a shadow in the rain. Penelope touched her fingers to her lips, feeling the ghost of his kiss still lingering there. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one of emotion and possibility that both exhilarated and terrified her. August brought relentless heat that baked the prairie to a golden brown. Penelope had grown more confident in her abilities, managing her small ranch with increasing competence. She'd expanded her vegetable garden, learned to bake decent bread, and even, under Isaac's patient tutelage, begun to ride the gentler of her 2 horses. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, with Isaac stopping by most evenings after his own work was done. Sometimes they worked side by side on small projects, other times they simply sat on her porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. The brief kiss during the storm had not been repeated, but something had shifted between them, a tacit acknowledgement of feelings growing deeper by the day. On a particularly stifling afternoon, Isaac arrived with an unexpected proposal. "There's a swimming hole about an hour's ride from here," he said, his shirt already damp with sweat despite the early hour. "Clear, cold spring water. I thought you might appreciate the chance to cool off." Penelope hesitated, aware of the impropriety but sorely tempted by the promise of relief from the heat. Would it be appropriate? Isaac's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I'm suggesting swimming, not impropriety. There's a secluded bend where ladies sometimes bathe. I'd keep watch from a respectful distance." The thought of cool water against her skin proved too tempting to resist. "Give me 15 minutes to change and pack some food," she decided. They rode out across the shimmering landscape, Penelope growing more comfortable on horseback with each passing week. Isaac led her through areas she hadn't yet explored, a narrow canyon where the temperature dropped blissfully as shadows engulfed them, then up a gentle slope to a plateau overlooking a verdant valley. "It's beautiful," Penelope breathed, reining her horse to a stop beside his. "I had no idea this was here." "Wyoming's full of surprises," Isaac said, his eyes on her rather than the view. "You just have to know where to look." The swimming hole proved to be everything he'd promised, a deep, crystal-clear pool fed by an underground spring, surrounded by cottonwoods that provided dappled shade. Isaac showed her the secluded bend he'd mentioned, separated from the main pool by a jetting rock formation. "I'll be over there," he said, pointing to a shady spot some distance away. "Take your time. No one comes here but me, most days." Alone in the sheltered cove, Penelope hesitated only briefly before stripping down to her chemise and drawers. The impropriety of it sent a thrill through her. Here was freedom such as she'd never known in Boston. Gathering her courage, she waded into the water, gasping at its shocking coolness against her heated skin. The sensation was heavenly. Penelope floated on her back, staring up at the blue sky through the canopy of leaves, feeling weeks of tension and fatigue dissolve in the spring's embrace. After the initial shock, the water temperature felt perfect, refreshing without being unbearable. After swimming until her muscles pleasantly ached, Penelope returned to the shore and quickly dressed. Her skin cooled and her spirits lifted. She found Isaac where he'd promised, dozing against a tree trunk, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "Your turn," she announced, enjoying his startled expression as he woke. "It's absolutely wonderful." Isaac stretched and stood, his movements fluid and athletic. "Glad you enjoyed it. One of my favorite spots in all of Wyoming." "I can see why." Penelope said, settling into the shade he'd vacated. Go on, I promise not to peek. Isaac laughed, a rich sound that warmed her more than the summer sun. I'll hold you to that, Miss Hargrove. While he swam, Penelope unpacked the food she'd brought: bread, cheese, dried apples, and a jar of preserves. She arranged it on a clean cloth, creating a picnic that, while simple, felt festive in these surroundings. When Isaac returned, his hair wet and his shirt clinging to his still damp skin, they shared the meal in companionable ease, talking and laughing as if they'd known each other for years rather than months. As they finished the last of the food, Isaac stretched out on the grass beside her, propped on one elbow. Penny, for your thoughts, he said, studying her face. Penelope smiled at the nickname he'd taken to using. I was just thinking how different my life is now from what I'd imagined it would be. Disappointed? He asked, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his features. No, she said truthfully. Surprised, perhaps. In Boston, everything was planned and predetermined. Here, each day brings something new. She plucked a blade of grass, twirling it between her fingers. It's terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Isaac nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's the West for you. Unforgiving sometimes, but never boring. And the people are not what I expected either, she added, meeting his gaze directly. Is that so? Isaac murmured, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The touch sent a shiver through Penelope that had nothing to do with the cool water or the light breeze. Without analyzing her actions, she leaned toward him, closing the distance between them until their lips met. Unlike their first brief kiss, this one deepened immediately. Isaac's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer as his mouth moved against hers with gentle insistence. Penelope responded with a passion that surprised them both, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, then his hair. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing rapidly. Isaac rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've been wanting to do that properly since the night of the storm, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. What took you so long? Penelope teased, though her own heart was racing. Isaac opened his eyes, his expression suddenly serious. Because once I started, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop. His hand cupped her cheek. You deserve better than a moment of weakness from me, Penny. The honorable intention behind his restraint touched her deeply. In Boston, men had pursued her for her family's wealth or social standing, their flattery masking calculation. Isaac's honesty was refreshing and far more seductive than any practiced charm. And if I don't want you to stop? She whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Isaac's eyes darkened. Then we'd best head back before I forget I'm a gentleman, he said, his voice strained. But he kissed her once more, thoroughly and with promise, before helping her to her feet. The ride back was filled with charged silence and stolen glances. Something fundamental had changed between them. Acknowledged feelings now demanded decisions about the future. As they approached Penelope's ranch, the setting sun painting the landscape in familiar gold and crimson hues, Isaac finally spoke. I care for you, Penny. More than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time. I care for you too, she replied simply. Isaac nodded, his face somber despite her words. I'm not a wealthy man. My ranch is modest, though it's growing. I can't offer you the luxuries you had in Boston. I didn't come west for luxury, Penelope reminded him. No, but I need you to be certain, Isaac insisted. Wyoming winters are harsh. The work never ends. It's not an easy life for anyone, especially a woman raised in comfort. Penelope reined her horse to a stop, forcing Isaac to do the same. Do you think me so fragile? So incapable of adapting? She challenged, a flash of temper in her voice. That's not what I meant, Isaac said quickly. I've seen how strong you are. How determined. He sighed, running a hand through his still damp hair. I just don't want you to have regrets. The only regret I have about coming west is that I didn't do it sooner, Penelope stated firmly. I'm not the same woman who arrived in May, Isaac. I know what I want now. And what is that? He asked, his voice low and intent. A life that's real. Work that matters. People who see me for who I am, not what I represent. She met his gaze steadily. And you, if you'll have me? The last of the sun's rays illuminated his face as a slow smile spread across it, not the polite smile he showed to strangers or the amused one he wore when teasing her, but something deeper and more profound. Penelope Hargrove, he said, reaching across the space between their horses to take her hand. I've been yours since you sat on that fence rail at sunset. In that moment, with the Wyoming sky ablaze above them and possibility stretching before them like the endless prairie, Penelope knew she had found her answer to his question from that first evening. There was nowhere else she'd rather be than right here, with this man, in this wild and beautiful land that had somehow become home. As summer gave way to fall, Penelope's life settled into a rhythm that would have been unimaginable to her Boston self. Her days were filled with physical labor that left her tired but satisfied, her evenings with Isaac's company. They were courting properly now, their intentions clear to each other and to the small community of prosperity. Isaac had introduced her to his ranch, the walking WA spread 3 times the size of her own, with a modest herd of cattle and several fine horses he was breeding. His cabin was larger than hers but similarly simple, though the bookshelves lining one wall had made her smile with delight. My mother's influence, he'd explained, running his fingers over the spines of volumes that had clearly traveled far to reach this remote place. She believed education wasn't just for schoolrooms. In turn, Penelope had written to her parents, informing them of her decision to remain in Wyoming permanently. Their reply had been predictably disapproving but resigned, acknowledging that at 25, she was entitled to make her own choices, however misguided they considered them. They think I've lost my mind, she told Isaac as they sat on her porch one crisp September evening, the letter crumpled in her lap. Father calls it my frontier folly and hopes I'll come to my senses before winter. Isaac's arm tightened around her shoulders. And will you? He asked lightly, though she could hear the thread of genuine concern beneath the question. Penelope leaned into his embrace, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I've never been more certain of anything, she assured him. Though I admit, I am somewhat apprehensive about winter. Everyone speaks of it with such ominous tones. It can be brutal, Isaac acknowledged. Temperatures that freeze your breath, snow that can bury a cabin, winds that cut like knives. He turned to face her, his expression serious. That's why I've been thinking we shouldn't wait until spring. Wait for what? Penelope asked, though her heart had begun to race at something in his tone. Isaac reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the fading light, a ring of twisted gold with a modest pearl at its center. To get married, he said simply. I love you, Penny. I want to face those winters together, in one home. If you'll have me. Though they had spoken around the subject, had acknowledged their feelings and intentions, the direct proposal still took Penelope's breath away. The ring in his palm represented everything she never thought to find, not just love, but partnership, respect, and a shared vision of the future. Yes, she whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. Yes, I'll have you, Isaac Walker. His smile was brilliant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was my mother's, he explained. Not fancy, but it's perfect, Penelope interrupted, admiring how the pearl caught the last of the sunset's glow. Absolutely perfect. Their kiss sealed the promise, tender at first, then deepening with the certainty of their commitment. When they finally broke apart, Isaac rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. October, he said. Before the first snow. A simple ceremony at the church, then a celebration at the walking W. What do you think? October sounds perfect, Penelope agreed. Though I have nothing grand to wear. Isaac laughed softly. Wear that blue dress you had on the night we danced. You looked beautiful enough to stop my heart. The memory of that night, how nervous she'd been, how surprised by the easy acceptance of the townspeople, how aware of Isaac's hand at her waist brought a smile to Penelope's lips. The blue dress it is, then. They sat together as darkness settled completely over the land, planning their future with quiet excitement. The ranch Penelope had inherited would be kept as grazing land for Isaac's expanding herd, while they would make their home at the Walking W. Come spring, they would add a room to the cabin, making space for the family they both hoped to create. "What will your Boston friends say when they hear you've married a cowboy?" Isaac teased as the night grew cooler, stars now brilliant overhead. Penelope laughed, imagining the scandalized expressions of her former social circle. "They'll be simultaneously horrified and secretly envious," she predicted. "Especially when they hear how handsome my cowboy is." Isaac's chuckle rumbled against her shoulder. "And what about you? Any regrets about trading silk for calico, ballrooms for barn dances?" Penelope considered the question seriously, taking stock of all she'd left behind and all she'd gained. "None," she said with conviction. "Though I do occasionally miss hot baths and ice cream." "Well, I can't promise ice cream," Isaac said, "but I might be persuaded to haul water for a hot bath now and then." "My hero," Penelope said dryly, but she nestled closer to him, content in a way she never imagined possible when she'd first sat on that fence rail, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake in coming west. News of their engagement spread quickly through Prosperity, meeting with universal approval. Martha Peterson immediately organized a quilting bee to create a wedding gift, while the pastor's wife, Ellen, took charge of the church decorations. Even the gruff blacksmith offered to craft a special branding iron combining their initials as a wedding present. "You've become quite the local favorite," Isaac observed as they rode back from town one afternoon, their saddlebags laden with supplies and well wishes. "Not bad for an Eastern lady who's been here less than 6 months." "People are kind," Penelope said. "I never expected to feel so welcome." "It's not just kindness," Isaac corrected. "You've earned their respect. Not everyone would have stuck it out like you have." Penelope glanced at him, curious. "Have there been others? Other Eastern women who came and left?" Isaac nodded, his expression thoughtful. "A few. The banker's wife lasted 3 months before returning to Philadelphia. The doctor's sister came to keep house for him last year. She was on the eastbound stage before Christmas." He smiled slightly. "Wyoming isn't for everyone." "But it's for me," Penelope said with certainty, urging her horse forward. "Race you to the creek." As October approached, preparations for the wedding intensified. Penelope cleaned and aired her blue dress, adding a new lace collar she'd ordered from the mercantile. Martha and the other women helped her preserve the last of her garden harvest, filling the cellar with enough food to see the newlyweds through the winter months. Isaac, meanwhile, worked with his ranch hands to build a proper bedroom addition onto his cabin, determined to have it ready before the ceremony. He also surprised Penelope with a cast-iron bathtub, hauled all the way from Cheyenne at considerable expense. "Your hot baths," he explained when she protested the extravagance. "I aim to keep my promises." The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cool, the aspen trees around Prosperity a blaze of gold against the blue sky. Penelope dressed with Martha's help, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the pearl buttons of her blue dress. "Nervous?" Martha asked, arranging wild flowers in Penelope's upswept hair. "A little," Penelope admitted. "Not about marrying Isaac, but about everything changing." Martha's kind eyes met hers in the mirror. "Marriage is a leap of faith," she said, her voice gentle with experience. "But when it's right, it's the best kind of adventure." The church was full when Martha escorted Penelope inside. It seemed the entire population of Prosperity had turned out for the occasion, filling the simple wooden pews and spilling out onto the steps. At the altar, Isaac waited, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. As Penelope walked toward him, their eyes locked, and suddenly the crowd disappeared. There was only Isaac, this man who had shown her a different way of living, who had seen her strength when she herself had doubted it, who loved her not despite her transformation but because of it. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows spoken with clear conviction that brought tears to more than one eye in the congregation. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac's kiss was tender but possessive, a promise of both passion and permanence that left Penelope breathless. The celebration afterward at the Walking W lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned with food contributed by every family in the area, fiddles and banjos played dance tunes, and children darted between the adults, adding to the festive atmosphere. Penelope found herself surrounded by well-wishers, accepted now not just as Isaac Walker's wife but as a valued member of the community in her own right. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Penelope found herself standing at the edge of the yard, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar hues of gold and crimson. Isaac appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. They stood in comfortable silence as the last guests called their goodbyes, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. In the distance, a coyote called, answered by another farther away, wild voices in the gathering darkness. "Come inside, Mrs. Walker," Isaac said eventually, taking her hand. "I've got the fire going." Their first night as husband and wife was everything Penelope had hoped for, tender, passionate, and filled with discoveries that left them both breathless with wonder. In Isaac's arms, she found a completion she hadn't known she was seeking, a belonging that transcended physical pleasure. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath quilts against the growing chill of the October night, the fire burning low in the hearth. "Tell me something I don't know about you yet," Penelope murmured, tracing the outline of a scar on Isaac's shoulder, a remnant of his war days he'd mentioned only briefly. Isaac was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then he spoke, his voice low in the darkness. "I was engaged once before. During the war. Her name was Rebecca." Penelope stilled her hand but didn't pull away. "What happened?" "Typhoid," Isaac said simply. "Swept through Richmond in '64. By the time I got leave to see her, she was already gone." "I'm sorry," Penelope whispered, understanding now some of his initial hesitation, his careful approach to their relationship. Isaac's arms tightened around her. "After that, I didn't think I'd ever want to risk loving someone again." His lips brushed her forehead. "Then I saw a stubborn Boston lady sitting on a fence rail at sunset, looking like she was ready to take on the whole frontier single-handed." Penelope smiled against his chest. "And what did you think in that moment?" "That you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen," Isaac admitted. "And that you looked as lost as I'd been when I first came west." "I was," Penelope acknowledged. "But not anymore." "No," Isaac agreed, his voice warm with satisfaction. "Not anymore." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the Wyoming frontier might bring, they would face them together. The winter of 1875-76 proved to be one of the harshest in living memory. By mid-November, snow blanketed the land, transforming the familiar landscape into a white wilderness that stretched endlessly in all directions. December brought bitter cold that froze water buckets solid and made every trip to the barn an exercise in endurance. Yet within the Walker cabin, warmth prevailed. Penelope discovered an unexpected joy in the enforced closeness of winter, in the rhythm of days measured by simple tasks and quiet evenings. She learned to make soap from rendered fat, to knit by firelight when daylight hours grew short, to bake bread that filled their small home with comforting aromas. Isaac proved to be a thoughtful husband, patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise. He taught her to play chess during the long evenings, read aloud from his collection of books, and kept his promise about the hot baths, hauling endless buckets of water from the well and heating them on the stove. "You spoil me," Penelope protested one night as she soaked in the luxury of the cast-iron tub, steam rising around her. Isaac, seated nearby whittling a small wooden figure, smiled without looking up. "I like seeing you happy," he said simply. "Besides, you work as hard as any man on this ranch. You've earned a little spoiling." It was true, Penelope had thrown herself into ranch life with determination that surprised even her. She rose before dawn with Isaac, helped with the morning chores, and learned to manage the household with an efficiency born of necessity. Though the work was harder than anything she'd known in Boston, it brought a satisfaction that idle social pursuits never had. January brought a week-long blizzard that kept them housebound, the wind howling like banshees around the cabin's sturdy walls. They passed the time with domestic tasks, conversation, and increasingly creative expressions of physical affection that left them both laughing and breathless. "If this keeps up, we might have a family edition come autumn," Isaac remarked one morning as they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, listening to the storm rage outside. Penelope blushed but didn't disagree. The thought of carrying Isaac's child, of building a family together in this wild place, filled her with nervous excitement rather than fear. "Would that please you?" she asked, studying his face in the gray light filtering through frost-covered windows. Isaac's expression softened as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "More than anything," he said softly. "A little girl with your spirit or a boy with your determination, either would be a blessing beyond measure." His words warmed Penelope more effectively than any fire. "I love you, Isaac Walker," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "More than I ever thought possible." His answer came not in words but in the tender way he gathered her close, his kiss a promise that needed no verbal elaboration. By February, Penelope's suspicions were confirmed. She was indeed expecting a child, due to arrive in late September. The news was met with joy not only by Isaac but by the entire community when they were finally able to travel into town after the worst of winter had passed. "The first Walker baby!" Martha exclaimed, hugging Penelope tightly. "Just wait until the quilting circle hears we'll have a cradle quilt finished before you can say diaper pin." Spring's arrival was gradual but welcome, the snow retreating in stages to reveal muddy ground that eventually gave way to fresh green grass and wildflowers. As the days lengthened and warmed, Penelope's body began to change, her pregnancy becoming visible beneath her dresses. Isaac watched these changes with undisguised wonder, his protective instincts intensifying even as he respected Penelope's determination to continue with her usual tasks as long as possible. "You'll tell me when it gets to be too much?" he asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, a ritual they'd maintained since their marriage. "I promise," Penelope assured him, though they both knew her definition of too much differed significantly from his. Summer brought its own challenges: heat that made Penelope's advancing pregnancy increasingly uncomfortable, a minor drought that threatened the hay crop, and increased activity from cattle rustlers in the area that kept Isaac and the other ranchers on alert. "I don't like leaving you alone," Isaac fretted one morning as he prepared to join a group of ranchers tracking suspected rustlers. "Not in your condition." "I'll be fine," Penelope insisted, packing food for his journey. "Martha promised to check on me, and I have the rifle if there's trouble." Isaac looked unconvinced but knew better than to argue. In the months of their marriage, he'd learned to respect his wife's capabilities while still honoring his own need to protect her. 3 days at most," he promised, kissing her goodbye. "If the baby decides to come early, it won't," Penelope interrupted firmly. "This child is as stubborn as its parents. It'll arrive precisely when planned." Isaac laughed, the worry in his eyes easing slightly. "God help us all if that's true," he said, kissing her once more before mounting his horse. Penelope watched him ride away, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen where their child kicked vigorously, as if protesting its father's departure. Despite her brave words, she felt a flutter of apprehension. The baby wasn't due for another month, but Martha had warned that first babies sometimes arrived early, especially in summer heat. The day passed uneventfully as Penelope occupied herself with small tasks around the cabin. By evening, however, she began to feel strange, not pain exactly, but a restless discomfort that made it impossible to settle. When Martha arrived for her promised visit, she took one look at Penelope and nodded knowingly. "Baby's coming," she announced with calm certainty. "Let's get you comfortable." "But it's too early," Penelope protested weakly, even as a sharp contraction gripped her midsection. And Isaac isn't here. Martha's practical efficiency brooked no argument. Babies come when they're ready, not when it's convenient, she said, helping Penelope to the bedroom. As for Isaac, we'll send word if there's time. If not, he'll have a fine surprise when he returns. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination as Penelope's body worked to bring new life into the world. Martha's experienced hands guided her through the process, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of sensation. You're doing beautifully, she encouraged as dawn approached and the birth grew imminent. Just a little longer now. With a final, monumental effort, Penelope pushed her child into the world, the pain instantly transformed into wonder as a lusty cry filled the room. A girl, Martha announced, tears in her eyes as she placed the squirming infant on Penelope's chest. A perfect little girl. Exhausted but exhilarated, Penelope gazed down at her daughter, a tiny, red-faced miracle with a shock of dark hair and her father's determined chin. Hello, Rebecca, she whispered, the name she and Isaac had chosen if the baby was a girl coming naturally to her lips. Welcome to Wyoming. As if in response, the baby opened her eyes newborn blue but with a clarity that seemed to look right into Penelope's soul. Martha busied herself with the practical matters of cleaning up while Penelope marveled at her daughter, counting tiny fingers and toes, memorizing the perfect bow of her mouth and the delicate arch of her eyebrows. She's beautiful, Martha said, returning with fresh linens. Isaac will be bursting with pride. As if summoned by his name, the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin. Moments later, the door burst open and Isaac appeared, his face etched with concern that transformed to wonder as he took in the scene before him. Penny, he breathed, crossing the room in 2 strides to kneel beside the bed. You're the baby. Your daughter decided not to wait for you, Penelope said, her voice weak but happy. Meet Rebecca Martha Walker. Isaac's eyes filled with tears as he gently touched his daughter's tiny hand. She's perfect, he whispered, voice choked with emotion. Just like her mother. Martha quietly excused herself, leaving the new family to their private joy. Isaac carefully sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Penelope's shoulders, his other hand still connected to his daughter's surprisingly strong grip. How did you know? Penelope asked, leaning against him gratefully. About the baby coming? I didn't, Isaac admitted. We caught the rustlers sooner than expected. I was on my way home when I met young Billy Simmons riding out to find me. He kissed her temple. I've never ridden so fast in my life. You're here now, Penelope murmured, her eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. That's all that matters. Isaac took the baby carefully into his arms, cradling her with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to Penelope's eyes. Sleep, my love, he said softly. Rebecca and I will get acquainted while you rest. As Penelope drifted toward sleep, the last thing she saw was Isaac sitting in the rocking chair by the window, holding their daughter close as he spoke to her in a low, gentle voice, telling her about the land that would be her heritage and the family that would always be her home. In that moment, all the questions of her life seemed answered. She had found where she belonged, not in Boston's drawing rooms or Wyoming's open spaces, but in the heart of this man and the family they were creating together. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. Rebecca grew from a determined infant into a spirited child with her father's love of the outdoors and her mother's quick intelligence. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, Martin, named for Penelope's uncle whose bequest had set this unlikely story in motion. The Walking W prospered under Isaac and Penelope's joint management, expanding to become one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Penelope's Eastern education proved unexpectedly valuable as she took over the business aspects of ranching, keeping meticulous records and negotiating favorable contracts that increased their profits year by year. In 1889, Wyoming was poised on the brink of statehood, and the formerly tiny settlement of Prosperity had grown into a respectable town with a school, a proper church, and even a small library that Penelope had helped establish. On a warm September evening, 14 years after their first meeting, Isaac and Penelope sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors of gold and crimson. Rebecca, now 13, was reading on a blanket nearby, while 9-year-old Martin attempted to teach their youngest child, 7-year-old Eleanor, how to twirl a lasso. "Do you ever miss it?" Isaac asked suddenly, his hand finding Penelope's where it rested on the arm of her chair. "Boston, I mean. The comforts, the culture." Penelope considered the question, thinking of the path her life might have taken had she not inherited her uncle's small ranch, had she not been sitting on that fence rail at sunset when a dusty cowboy rode up and asked where she'd rather be. "No," she said truthfully. "I've never belonged anywhere as completely as I belong here." She squeezed his hand. "With you." Isaac smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening evidence of years spent squinting against the Wyoming sun and laughing with the family he adored. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about taking a trip east next spring. The children should see something of the world beyond Wyoming. And you might enjoy showing us your Boston." The suggestion surprised Penelope. "Really? You'd want to go?" "I think it's time." Isaac nodded. "Rebecca's old enough to appreciate it, and Martin's curiosity knows no bounds." His eyes twinkled. "Besides, I'd like to meet these parents of yours who thought I wasn't good enough for their daughter." Penelope laughed softly. "They'll eat their words when they see what we've built here." "What you've built," Isaac corrected gently. "You're the one who took a chance on this life, Penny." "On me. Best decision I ever made," Penelope said with certainty. From the yard came Eleanor's delighted squeal as she successfully twirled the small lasso Martin had made for her, followed by Rebecca's applause. The sound of their children's laughter against the backdrop of the Wyoming twilight was, to Penelope's ears, the sweetest music imaginable. Isaac stood and offered his hand. "Come on, Mrs. Walker. Let's go congratulate our daughter on her roping skills before she decides to lasso the chickens again." As they joined their children in the yard, Penelope felt a sense of completion that transcended simple happiness. This life so different from what she'd been raised to expect had given her purpose, partnership, and a love that had only deepened with the passing years. That night, as she lay beside Isaac in the darkness of their bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of the Wyoming night, Penelope remembered that long-ago evening when a dusty cowboy had asked her where she'd rather be. The answer, it turned out, had always been here beneath this vast sky, on this wild land, with this good man and the family they had created together. Not in some imagined elsewhere, but in the life they had built through hard work, mutual respect, and a love that had weathered all seasons. "I love you, Isaac Walker," she whispered, curling into his embrace as she had for 14 years. "And I love you, Penelope Walker," he murmured back, his voice deep with contentment. "More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow." It was, Penelope thought as sleep claimed her, the perfect ending to a story that had begun with a sunset, a fence rail, and a question that had changed her life forever.